Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Squared Up Coffee Break webinar. This week, we're going to be discussing integrating Splunk. I'm joined today by Adam Kinniburgh.
Hi, Matthew.
Adam is the head of our support test and systems team and is also our resident Splunk expert here. So he's going to be helping us through this today. Now, we're talking Splunk with this integration, but because we're using the Web API provider to do that, and because ultimately Splunk is showing us event data, if you're using a different tool, like you're using Azure Log Analytics, you're using Elasticsearch, you're using Elk, the same concepts basically apply to all of those, and certainly the same capabilities exist. If you are using like Elk or Elasticsearch, please reach out to us, hello@squareup.com, because we'd love to hear from you and make sure that the integration stories are really good with those products as well, because it's not something we've currently played around with too much internally to date. So with that, let's go on to the webinar. So this week, we're going to be looking at integrating Splunk events alongside SCOM data into Squared Up. And we're doing that by the Web API tile. Now, I'm not going to dig into the Web API tile itself too much this week because we already got a webinar on that. So if you haven't seen the coffee break previously on the Web API connector in Squared Up, definitely go and check that out after this. However, that said, we'll show you everything you need to get it working with Splunk. So if you only care about integrating it with Splunk, stick around here and this is the perfect video for you. And it's really light and simple one this week. We're going to be connecting to Splunk. We'll show you some simple queries. Really, we're not here to teach you how to use Splunk. We're here just to integrate it. So I'm sure you can take all the queries you got today and run those. And then we'll also show you just a little bit more of an advanced concept by using Splunk on a perspective to do things like, for example, show you all events for a particular computer or a particular object inside Squared Up. Okay, so let's get started. I just want to top the webinar quickly with Web API integration. Now, the short story here, and again, we're going into more detail on this in the webinar on Web API specifically, is that we integrate data from other sources and put them alongside SCOM data in a single pane of glass. We don't aggregate or store that data inside Squared Up as well. So that queries live API data and displays it on your dashboard. There's no extra storage. There's no extra agents involved. So you're not going to have to spec out your servers differently to cope with putting this data in. There's no special configuration changes required to Splunk. It's your Splunk environment as you have it and your SCOM environment as you have it. And because the data is displayed from a perspective or from a dashboard that you may or may not have permission to in Squared Up, we effectively apply SCOM RBAC to these Splunk queries, because if you can't get to a perspective on a particular object because you don't have access to it in SCOM, well, then you can't view that query data inside Squared Up. So it's a nice way of sort of permissioning that without having to go and set up all these extra users in Splunk as well and teach them how to use it and train them how to use it. And it makes it very easy to share throughout the whole enterprise because, if you stick some data on an OA dashboard, you haven't had to go and teach everyone else, maybe your boss or whatever else, how to use this stuff. They can just consume it quite happily and keep using the existing tools today. So it's a very, very powerful, very common story. Okay. Words are worth quite a bit, but a picture's even better. So I've got a nice little diagram here that should help to sort of integrate. It should show off how this stuff works. So let's say you've got your users and they're happily viewing dashboards inside Squared Up. If one of those dashboards features a Web API tile that queries Splunk, what happens is the Squared Up server reaches out to Splunk using the user account configured for communicating with Splunk, not the user's account. It then returns, the Splunk API returns data back to Squared Up, and that's then displayed immediately on the dashboard, and that's cached for a few seconds as well, so if someone else requests exactly the same data, rather than Squared Up going and talking to Splunk again, it just displays the data very quickly. So that's a nice, easy, lightweight way of getting Splunk data into a single tool alongside SCOM without you having to go and perform a whole bunch of extra infrastructure work or worry about like, oh God, I've got 1,000 users. How am I going to give them permissions and teach them the tool and everything else? Okay, so hopefully that kind of explains how this works. So with that, let's get out of PowerPoints and we're going to go straight to demo, and I'm going to let Adam sort of lead us and take over here. So Adam, what are we looking at?
Okay, so we're going to start by, creating a Web API provider. This is what connects Squared Up to Splunk. In our sort of testing lab, we're just using basic authentication. So we're going to set up a basic provider. So from within Squared Up, it's up to the hamburger menu, into system, and then onto Web API. And in here you can see an example. So we've got our base URL set as our Splunk server. We are only basically initiating search jobs, pulling back results. So rather than having to type services/search/jobs every time we create a tile, we've sort of just hard coded this in at this stage, and every one of our tiles is using this URL.
Okay.
As it's a lab, we haven't put a signed SSL cert on it, so we have the ignore SSL certs option enabled. And
Super secure.
And we're passing through just a basic authorization header. Note that this is a username and password separated with a colon that has been base 64 encoded.
Right. So to get that value, it's a username and password combo for connecting to Splunk.
Yep, correct.
And I've used a tool like you could use PowerShell, or you could go to like base64 encode.org, whack in your credentials there, and it spits out a string, and you copy and paste that in.
Yeah, it's really simple. So yeah, it's just authorization as the key and basic space, and then the result as your value. If you click Save Provider, you'll get the very nice looking little green tick.
Right.
And we're set up to connect to Splunk. Providing all that information is correct, it will allow us to run some searches.
Okay. So normally they'd hit Add Provider to go and add that, but we already had it in here.
Yeah.
One thing that's worth noting, I guess, is this URL, that port number, that's the API for Splunk,
that's the default out of the box port on HTTPS for the API.
Right, so that would be different to the one that you as a user browse to, is my point.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. So our Splunk UI is on port 8000, which again is their sort of default port. The API is called on a different port, and the reason for that we'll explain in a little while.
Okay, cool. So I've configured my provider, and it's coming back green and looks okay.
Yeah.
What's next?
So we'll start by, we would create just a sort of basic dashboard.
Okay.
So in this case, we're thinking about monitoring sort of errors from some key systems.
Okay.
So if we go into the Web API tile and set it to grid.
Okay, so that'll display a list of entries rather than a single number.
Yeah, rather than a number, and just choose the provider that we created. So that's the Splunk provider.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, we're going to post rather than get.
Okay.
So we're going to send something to the Splunk server, and we're going to use a variable to make it return the values that meet our search. Like I mentioned, the URL is it's already hard baked with the right endpoint for search jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't need to do anything else there, but set it to post.
Mm-hmm.
So if you hit next, under headers and data, this is where it gets a little bit more sort of complicated, if you like.
Right.
There are a number of variables that we need to pass through. I guess the sort of obvious core one is the actual search that we want it to carry out.
Right.
So in this case, we're going to be searching. You have to begin. You have to put search in each box, and then we're going to begin by searching for an index through an index that I've created called WinEventLog, and we're going to look for any, say, health service jobs from the source name will be health service.
That's the SCOM agent, basically.
So, yeah, exactly right. So in this case, we're searching for an index I've created for anything coming from the SCOM health service, and I want it to be errors only.
Right.
So type is error.
So this sort of obviously got search there at the front, but this index source name health, that's just a Splunk query.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. So we could copy and paste that into Splunk and run it, and it would give us the same results that we'll get here.
Cool. Okay, so that's the search one. I need a few more bits then.
So we'll add a few more. So we'll start by adding exec mode, execution mode. In this case, we're going to set it as one shot. So if you search through the sort of Splunk documentation, one shot asks Splunk. We sort of post a request, and with one shot, it also returns the results. If we don't use that, it's all sort of one-way requests. We're requesting it to run a search, but it's not going to give us anything unless we use one shot.
Right, okay. Because it would normally then say, okay, here's the results. You can get them.
We'd then have to query for a job ID, and we could then get the results of that job ID.
Okay, cool.
Doesn't work for us in Squared Up, so the one-shot exec mode sort of solves that for us.
I believe that's Martin Ernst who told us about that the first time around, wasn't it?
Yeah, our best friend in Norway, Martin Ernst.
Thanks, Martin.
King amongst men.
Okay, so what else do we need here?
So yeah, we'll add max time. So this is basically just a timeout.
Mm-hmm.
If the query runs within Splunk for more than, in this case, 30 seconds, it'll end and it won't return any values. The reason we add this is just you don't want to overload your Splunk server. It's already doing quite a lot, so we're making sure that Squared Up is not going to add any burden.
Okay.
We also want to define sort of what time period we want the search to query for events for. So earliest time sets the starting point, and it's basically by a minus number of hours. So from 24 hours ago in this case.
Right. I'm assuming the API lets you have other values in there as well.
You can use UTC strings to set specific dates and times. But in our case, we want it to be sort of dynamic and return data that's up to the last 24 hours.
Okay.
So we also want to tell it the latest time, which is basically how current it can be, and we'll just use now in this one.
Right, okay. So that literally is the last days of stuff.
Yeah, anything that's between now and 24 hours ago will be returned.
Okay, cool.
We also want the API to return data in a format that Squared Up can use, so we'll set the output mode to JSON.
Right, okay. And that's a mandatory one, right? Like
That's without that you will never get any results.
Okay.
And we will also set the timeout. So this is easy to confuse with max time. Timeout is how long Splunk will keep the search query active for. So after it's finished, after it's returned all the results, how long it persists in Splunk for as something you can call back again through the API. We really don't sort of care about getting back old search jobs at this stage. So 10 seconds means it's pretty much gone after we've been given the information. And if we hit refresh in Squared Up, it will run the same query again, get fresh results. The default for this is a full day within Splunk. So it's worth just basically to keep your sort of Splunk UI nice and clean.
Ramp that down.
Yeah, 10 seconds we found works really well.
Yep. And it's worth noting that because Squared Up has its own caching mechanism anyway for queries that are exactly the same that have occurred recently, which is, I think, I can't exact time, but it's less than a minute. Basically, if you are worried about this dashboard, people repeatedly viewing this dashboard and saying that's a query to Splunk, it probably won't anyway, because the query will be exactly the same, and therefore it will just be cached by Squared Up, and it won't even actually request anything from Splunk.
Yeah, exactly. Letting it time out isn't not letting it time out, but giving it a finite lifespan is a great option.
Cool. Okay, so if I hit apply changes, that will send that data along.
So we'll instantly get some results at this point.
Looks very meaningful.
Yeah, what we're getting here is a summary of the job that has just run. So we're not getting the actual results of the search, we're getting sort of proof that it has happened.
But I can see there's a results column here.
Yes, so we'll, in this response data tab, we'll set the key path to results.
Right,
so this sort of pushes us into the API results within that column, and we will get its sort of sub-columns. So this looks a bit better. We have a message, we have information about where it came from, we have some timestamps, event types, and at this stage we're basically just hiding the columns we don't want.
Right. So if you haven't seen this before, go and check out the WebAPI coffee break where we talk about the grid design in more detail, but effectively we can click here and say, so which ones do I want? I want the message,
Let's go for time. That's quite a useful one.
Okay, so get rid of that, get rid of the type.
And let's keep source if it's still there.
I might have got rid of it. Oh, there is the bottom, source. So you don't want line count, index. Do you want the host? Do you want the host?
Yeah, let's keep host. So we're querying multiple computers here, so let's see what
you can see the changes happening immediately at the bottom anyway, so you can tell what you're getting rid of and not. So hide.
Yeah, we can lose raw.
And serial.
Yeah, the SI key.
SI can go as well. Message time, host, source. Is the source always the same?
Well, in this case, yes, because we've specified it as operations manager, as the health service, so it's always going to be from that particular log.
Okay, and I can reorder these as well, so do that very quickly. Right.
Yeah.
So there we go. The host it came from, the time, and the message.
So yeah, I think it would be useful if we, let's change the column headers, lose some of those underscores, make them look a bit prettier.
Okay. So time logged.
Yeah, and let's also
message is fine, I think, probably.
Sort of truncated UTC strings, not that great for us. So let's use time ago to give that a custom label, so we can actually see relative to now when it happened.
So if you haven't seen this before, and this is, check out the custom labeling and also the WebAPI coffee break. But basically, we can reformat a particular column. So here I can say time ago and then value. And what we're doing here is we're using a function in Squared Up to say take a UTC ISO 8601 date. And then reformat that to show me when it happened. So in this case, 4, 6, 7, 18 hours. There we go.
There are options within the Splunk API to specify a time format. So you can give it a string, you can make it UTC, you can give it an offset to match your own time zone. But if you suffer daylight savings time like we do here in the UK, using time ago like this is great because it's always relative to the time it is right now.
Right. And also, if you've got people in just different zones, if you hard code it to say, I always assume it's 5 hours and out.
Yeah, exactly.
And someone who's not is going to have an incorrect times in the dashboard. So this is also looking a bit long with the computer name here. So I'm going to do another quick.
Yeah, let's split that. So, get rid of the domain name.
Value.split. So we'll split this on the full stops and then only take the first part.
Again, there are some examples of this on the document on the Squared Up support site as well.
So, and the last thing you might have happen is that if one of the columns is excessively long, like the message is here, for example, you can see it's basically causing the rest of the dashboard to truncate quite heavily.
Yeah.
So here, if you do have some instances where, and this is pretty illegible anyway, unless you're interactively viewing and clicking on the expanders, you can actually put one last one on here just to force this to maybe only show us value.sub str to show the first 230 characters, which is often with an event all we necessarily need anyway to know what's happening.
Yeah, that's great. Let's chop that off. Columns fit nicely. And we have potentially some quite meaningful data coming back from our sort of SCOM management servers. Cool.
So I'm going to flip to a dashboard we created earlier that kind of shows this sort of completed. So you can see here we've got the same thing basically for Active Directory or SQL.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess we can display anything effectively that Splunk can collect. And these are just effectively the same setup every time, but different queries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the options like one-shot execution mode, they're all the same. All we're doing here, and again in Splunk's own query language, we are just searching. In this case, it's the same index, but we're looking for anything from the DFSR logs or the netlogon logs.
Right.
Which, like I said, we have a Splunk lab, so don't judge us on the sort of lack of data, the low amount of data we're collecting with it. But yeah, anything that you put in there, it's from Splunk, so you can actually start like Matthew's doing now. We could start by building a query in Splunk through their UI, and then just copy and paste that over into Squared Up, and we'll pull all the same data back.
Cool. So I just had a question come in by the chat. If there's any chance of us having a refresh timer, the tiles actually update every 60 seconds along with the dashboard anyway.
Yeah.
So they are actually live. When you come in here, you'll get an immediate query, and then every 60 seconds, it'll re-query for the same information. So they will actually update. Cool. So yeah, as Adam was showing there, just go into Splunk basically and run your query. If you know you're creating a ton of tiles that have everything the same bar like the query itself, there is a clone button over here you can click.
Yes.
And it'll clone the tile, and then you can just come in and change the query. And especially if, like in this case, the time, the host, the message, these are all the same column. So
absolutely,
the format is configured once kind of works quite well for that. Okay, so that's a simple dashboard done. At Ignite, we were showing off something quite cool, which is doing this with a perspective. Have you got an example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we just browse to sort of my user VM, thank you very much, and you'll see along the perspective ribbon we have a Splunk perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So very similar configuration to the dashboard that we just looked at. We haven't got a host column because we know which computer this relates to. It's a perspective. So all this is doing is this is firing a search into Splunk, and it's asking for any log entries for my computer in the last hour. And we're doing that by piping in a SCOM ID, well, not a SCOM ID, sorry, a variable from SCOM, which is display name. So the query that goes through to the Splunk API is just as we built it on the sort of the fixed dashboard.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, it'll send through computer name equals and then the name of my computer. So, I mean, it's perfect. If you browse to another computer, you're running a different search, you're getting different results.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see all of those searches in the Splunk UI coming through. So when you load the page, if you just hit search and then expand my search history, you'll see the top one should be a query. It just hasn't updated yet, but it will.
You can see the previous ones there, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see all of the searches that have been run through the UI. So again, I mean, you could make this really concise. You know, this is a user virtual machine. It's not a core server, if you like. So you might just want to know when logon attempts have failed, or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So you can specify many other variables in here, searching for only errors or audit failures, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the example we're showing off at Ignite was using Splunk and using OMS and basically showing an on-prem and in the cloud version of this, where you're collecting like RDP logons and software changes and service changes and showing those events and being able to say, look, now you can see when someone has logged on and made a change in this machine, because that doesn't usually break by itself. So having that extra value of, look, actually, here's these events telling you what was going on the machine, in addition to alerts telling you now that something is broken, is really, really powerful. So I guess in terms of like these properties and what's available, it's any SCOM property from the object you're currently looking at. So as long as you can tie that to a field or maybe a index or something inside Splunk, it can work. And if you want to see which ones are available, if you go to the monitored entity tab for an object, the properties are all shown here on the list. Display name isn't in the list, but basically display name is the name of the thing as it appears at the top here. And usually it's exactly the same as one of the fields anyway. So like principal name, for example, is the display name for a computer. So yeah, as long as you've got a property here somewhere that matches a value that's useful for a Splunk query, you can parameterize this for like databases.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So you could say that it's the host, or you could do this for an application. So if you've created an index for, this is our sales app, these are all the events we care about for sales app. When you go to a DA, we could say we'll query for things in that index, and then it would show you everything in there. And as Splunk's updated, it would automatically update as well.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right.
So it's really, with perspectives, I think this is really, really powerful. Like a top level dashboard's kind of cool, but when it's added with the perspective as well, you get a lot of context suddenly, and you're not having to sort of provide these parameters all the time or build hundreds of dashboards to show you all these different things. You can sort of template this and build a couple of dashboards, or a couple of perspectives, I should say, that make sense, and then have that data fire out and bring Splunk alongside, say your ServiceNow information and your SCOM information and
absolutely,
whatever else you've got.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be sort of like this, a dedicated perspective. You might have some performance graphs alongside. You can see particular filtered errors that relate to performance-related issues alongside some nice graphs that show you issues on the server.
Mm-hmm.
You can really get some value out of adding the Splunk data alongside some other stuff.
Yeah, I won't go through the full configuration there, but I mean, if you're new to Squared Up, go and check out some of the perspective stuff we've shown previously in our coffee breaks, and you can see like combining data together in one place is a really sort of powerful story. Okay, so just want to jump back to slides and cover off a couple of sort of recommendations and best practices. So this is a summary slide that just summarizes the options that we've covered there and what you need to do to configure this. So if you go onto our blog, we'll have the slide deck available up there. So if in like a week's time you're like, what was the option they had again? Rather than having to try and scroll through the video to find the exact point, this slide will be available to you, or you can screenshot the slide now if you're going to go and play with this immediately.
We'll also have a knowledge base article up hopefully in the next few days.
Yep, excellent. That's what we like to hear. So you can go on docs.squaredup.com and you can see that article that I walk through there. Now, in terms of actually configuring this, not just with Splunk, but with any sort of web API system, there's a couple of recommendations we'd try and make sure you keep in mind. It's definitely worthwhile getting hold of the API documentation, or schmoozing your subject matter expert for this. So like if I want to create a new perspective or link into Squared Up, Splunk into Squared Up, I'm going to go and schmooze Adam and say, hey, can you help me out with this stuff?
Yeah, and I'd then look at the API documentation.
Okay, right. So let's go and just look at that straight away. So yeah, so there is documentation on that, isn't there? dev.splunk.com/REST API.
Yeah.
And then you were saying it's the reference manual?
Yeah, absolutely. All the endpoints are very well documented. All the variables, what they do, everything is highlighted. And there are also some great tutorials for using the API to query things.
Our internet is not that fast. There you go. Oh, that's excellent. So you've got literally everything you need to dig through that. And I think they had some walkthroughs as well. But you were saying the other thing you can do is, the other sort of recommendation we have on the slide there was using another tool to test the inputs and outputs. So typically we say use PowerShell or curl or Postman, something like that to fire queries at the API and see the results without Squared Up getting in the way. But you were saying there's actually an explorer for this, isn't there?
Yeah, out of the box, if you just browse to the same sort of URL that we put into Squared Up,
right?
You get a visual sort of API explorer. So for example, if you click through services and were to then find search and then jobs, you'll see the same data that we are querying and pulling back. So you can use this as a really simple tool to sort of explore the API, find out what data is presented through different endpoints. So in this case, you can see the search term that was used. If you have some, for example, you have a saved job that runs on a schedule, you might want to, for example, know the job ID so that you can have a dashboard that just pulls back the results of that saved job.
Oh, right.
If you were to click, for example, on this search that's just happened at the top, you'll see right there in the URL you have a job number. So you could drop that straight into Squared Up next to the base URL, and any data that's returned would always be about that particular job. So if it is a recurring job, you'll always get data for that job.
So if you've already gone and configured loads of recurring jobs in Splunk, you don't have to rewrite all the queries.
No,
you can
absolutely.
just leverage what's there.
Yeah, so you can either fire the queries in directly, as we've just shown, using all those variables, or if you have everything running already in Splunk, you can just pull results back instead.
Cool. Excellent. So yeah, you check that API Explorer out. It'll make things a lot easier when you're playing around with this. And then the last one is that users who need to create API tiles that leverage Splunk or any web API will need to have the construct sensitive queries permission inside Squared Up to be able to create or edit web API tiles. That permission really should only be given to extremely trusted users. And the reason is that you are saying those users are allowed to create tiles that run any arbitrary SQL query for systems that Squared Up can connect to, and they're allowed to run any arbitrary web query against systems that Squared Up can connect to. So obviously, if you don't trust those users to not write queries that blow up Splunk or do horrible things to databases, then that's something you should probably address. That said, obviously, when you configure the account, so we plumbed in, we created the provider, a user account into Splunk, don't give it more permissions than it needs. It only needs to be able to query the API. Don't give it permissions to go and delete everything because it doesn't need that. But that permission is still somewhat sensitive. It's probably not worth giving that to your day one interns. Maybe only give it to users who are very much embedded with Squared Up. And if there are people who want to create this stuff and you don't necessarily think it's safe, then you can always hold that permission back for them and just get them to ask you to create it. So if you're creating perspectives for a lot of this stuff, you should find that will really cut down the number of ones you have to create. So it shouldn't be too much of a burden on you guys. Okay. So I think with that sort of taken us to time and we've covered over most of the sort of key points there.
Absolutely.
As I said, if you're integrating this with Splunk or you're using Elk or Elasticsearch, we'd love to hear from you and see the kind of cool things that you're doing with this stuff. As a shout out to Martin, who's already shared some of the stuff he's been doing with Splunk as well. But we love to make sure that what we say the product can do, it actually can do meaningfully for you guys. So if you're trying this and thinking, oh, this is just too hard, or you maybe need some UI enhancements, or perhaps there's a use case that you'd love to achieve with integrating Splunk or another sort of log search tool and you can't today, definitely get in touch and we'd love to help you out with trying to make that work. Okay, so that said, I'm going to wrap up the coffee break and just go through resources. If you have an idea for a topic you'd love us to cover on these coffee breaks, then please go to squareup.com/topics. We have a survey there that you can fill out where we have a whole bunch of topics that we think would be good to talk about, and also there's a free text field so you can suggest any topics if we've sort of missed one off. So definitely go and check that out and vote something up if you've got a great idea for something you'd love to achieve with SCOM and Squared Up, or another product we can integrate with. If you want to see what's coming up next, or sign up a colleague, well, after you've seen this, think, hey, maybe I should show my Splunk guy this webinar, go to squareup.com/coffee-break-series. There's a sign up form there and you can see the upcoming agenda as well. The recordings and slides are published via our blog, along with a wealth of other great content as well. So if you haven't seen that before, go and have a look at that. As I said, tomorrow the slides from this session will be up there. So if you need that summary slide to see all the query options, you can go and grab it from our blog. And then finally, there's a YouTube playlist with all previous 27 coffee breaks on there. So definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen that before. There's a wealth of good sort of enterprise monitoring content there around Squared Up and SCOM, and we have some case studies and there's loads of really good stuff there. So go look at that, particularly if you've seen this web API thing and thinking, I want to use that in the future. As I said, there's like a nice detailed webinar on both doing it generically and also doing it specifically with ServiceNow, which we covered too. So it's worth checking out if you're interested in either of the systems. Now, as always, the engineering team, along with myself and Adam, are online here to take questions. So if you have questions on anything you've seen today, or you have any questions about other sort of SCOM and Squared Up topics, please feel free to ask those in the chat. If you haven't got any questions, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you next week, guys.